Okay, it looks like we are good to go.
Wonderful. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth meeting of the Energy Code Board. Grateful for you all being here today, and we'll go ahead and dive in. We've got lots of great information to cover with you guys.
Robert and
Now I gotta go on this.
If you guys don't mind muting yourselves, I'm not sure who that was popping in. That is always appreciated. All right. Oh, Adam, do you mind making me a co-host so I can share my screen?
Just doing that, yes.
There we go. All right.
we bought more purple juice.
All right. Awesome. So today our agenda is as follows. We are going to first start with approval of the meeting minutes from last meeting. And then we have an update on the board seat that we shared an email with you guys about for one of our board members. And then we'll dive into the topic of today, which is the EV ready codes. So we'll start by looking at the definitions of EV ready spaces that were included within the state statute. And we'll compare those to the 2024 proposed code language. We'll also go through all of the 2024 proposed EV code language, knowing that it is a draft, just to sort of ground us in what the ICC is considering for the EV language for the next code cycle. And then we'll spend some time looking at the full suite of residential EV codes across the state of Colorado. And then we'll look at the commercial codes across the state of Colorado. Within both of those, we'll look at the elements that are similar and those communities that have unique elements to the EV code, so you guys can understand the breadth of the different codes out there. Towards the end of the meeting, we are going to review in full with the board all of the decisions that we're going to need to make between now and the end of the board's meeting cycle at the end of March. Because this is the last informational meeting that we're going to have, we wanted to tee everybody up to understand how we're going to be discussing and reviewing and voting on all of the code elements from here until the end of March. So we'll review all of the decisions that you guys are going to need to make between now and then we'll talk through our proposed process for getting this board to make all of those decisions through our meeting cycle. After we've shared both of those things, would love any thoughts or comments that you guys have on the process, so we can make sure that it's set up to serve the board as best as possible. So with that, I'll kick it off by starting us with the approval of the meeting minutes. And if anybody has any suggested changes to the minutes, please let us know. Otherwise, would love to get a motion for approval.
To approve the minutes as presented, and thank you for the completeness of them.
Motion to approve.
Thank you, Tim. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, and all in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you, everyone. And anyone, oh, thanks. And anyone, I get, what is the word? Does not approve. Does anyone not approve?
Opposed. Anyone opposed?
Anyone opposed? Thank you, David. Anyone opposed? Okay. Hearing no opposes, we will go ahead and approve the meeting minutes from our third meeting. Thank you all. Okay, so our next item on the agenda is the board seat discussion and vote, and I'm going to pass it off to Adam to share an update on where we've landed with this discussion item.
Thanks, Kim. So as you all saw in the email that Kim sent out last week with the agenda, Mary Weiner, who is our current utility board member, fills our utility seat on the board, has left her position at Holy Cross and has taken a different position that is not within the utility industry. I have spoken to Mary ahead of this, and we had originally indicated on the agenda that the board would be voting. However, after consultation with our attorney, David, we have come to the conclusion that there is reason within the requirements of the statute, as well as the requirements that we adopted in the bylaws, that means that Mary will need to resign from her seat as she no longer fulfills the statutory requirement of being within a utility employee. So that we are sorry to see her go, but unfortunately that is what the statute is requiring. So I just wanted to turn it over, Mary. I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to say before we finish.
No, you guys, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to get off the board, but I totally understand. And it was a little, just say it's been a pleasure working with you all. I'm sure you're gonna come up with some great codes. I am working with a nonprofit doing electrification. So looking forward to seeing what you guys are gonna put out so we can take your good steps forward. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mary. And just because you will be resigning your seat, I think it would be unfortunately appropriate if we ask you to leave for today. Yep, but
of course,
we appreciate your participation thus far, and we look forward to working with you in different capacities moving forward.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
And then I will just let the rest of you know that per the bylaws and the state statute that we will be working with Director Tour, as that was one of the Colorado Energy Office's seats on the board to fill, to be looking for a replacement. So we will circle back up with Will, who was unfortunately not able to join us today, about finding that replacement and appointing them so we can have a full board as quickly as possible. So hopefully an update on that by within the next couple of weeks, hopefully by the next meeting. And I will turn it back over to Kim.
Awesome. Thank you, Adam. Okay, so let's continue on with our agenda today. So first, we are going to start with reviewing the EV ready definitions that were provided within the state statute. And to start this, I just wanted to provide a high level sort of umbrella look at the terminology that we're going to be looking at. And I find these little diagrams super helpful for kind of picturing how these different space types work. So within the EV readiness requirements, there are three to four space types that are identified. You'll have an EV capable space, an EV ready space, and an EV supply equipment installed space. And so these three spaces are sort of the nuts and bolts of an EV ready code. They're the types of spaces that a project would need to implement. An EV capable parking space means that there is electric panel capacity available for that charging, for that electric vehicle charging station. And there's branch circuit, meaning the wiring coming from the panel, and raceway that holds that circuit, that terminates somewhere within a set boundary of where the EV space is. So EV capable just means you've got the electric capacity to install a future charger. EV ready means that branch circuit and raceway ends in an outlet, and that outlet is basically ready to be plugged and played for a future EV charger. Now, EV installed means that you have an EV charging station installed in that space. So that's sort of the high level review, and we'll kind of dive into a little bit more of the detail around what these mean in practice. So House Bill 22-1362 included definitions for EV capable, EV ready, and EV installed equipment, EV supply equipment. So starting with an EV capable space, state statute defines this as a space that has the electric panel capacity and conduit to support the implementation of a future electric vehicle charging station with a minimum electric service that you see listed there. So it has to have at least 208 volts and 40 with a 40 amp rated circuit. It also must be the electric wiring must be adjacent. It must end adjacent to the space itself. So it needs to be within the vicinity of that space. And then the bullet C there is basically just saying if the conduit ends between two parking spaces, that EV capable is referring to both of those parking spaces. Now, we wanted to pull the House bill definition as opposed to the 2024 IECC draft language. And again, this is in draft form, but this is the language that we might expect to see in the next iteration of the IECC, just to see how they're different. And so the IECC draft is a little bit more generalized. It says the designated automobile parking space is provided with electric infrastructure, such as, but not limited to, raceways, cables, electrical capacity, and panel board or other electrical distribution equipment necessary for the future installation of an EVSE. So very similar, just a little less prescriptive in the definition with the IECC. And that is the same. These definitions apply both to residential spaces as well as commercial spaces. Moving on to an EV ready space. So per House Bill 22-1362, this means a parking space that has the electrical panel capacity, raceway wiring, receptacle, which is that outlet, and circuit overprotection devices installed to support the future EV charging station with that minimum 208 volts at a 40 amp rated circuit. It's adjacent to the space. So, or the electric equipment in the receptacle is adjacent to the space. And then similarly with the EV capable, if that outlet ends in or is between two spaces, EV ready applies to both of those spaces. Looking at the 2024 IECC draft language, again, a little less prescriptive, a little more generalist. An EV ready space is defined as an automobile parking space that is provided with a branch circuit and either an outlet, junction box, or receptacle that will support the future EV supply equipment. And if you guys have any questions or thoughts as we're going through this, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Tim, let me get through the last definition and then we'll get to your question there. Okay, and then the final definition that was included in House Bill 2262 is for the EV supply equipment. So this is not necessarily an EV SE space where this equipment is installed, but this is the terms that dictate what that equipment needs to be able to provide or what needs to be able to do. So this is an electric vehicle charging system that has power capacity of at least 2.6 kilowatts and the ability to connect to the internet, or it's an inductive residential charging system for battery-powered electric vehicles that meets the requirements of 1 through 4 that you see listed on the screen. Within the 2024 IECC, an EVSE, which is the electric vehicle supply equipment, is defined as equipment for plug-in power transfer, including the undergrounded, grounded, and equipment grounding conductors, and the electric vehicle connections, attached plugs, personal protection systems, and all other fittings, devices, power outlets, or apparatuses installed specifically for the purpose of transferring energy between the premises' wiring and electric vehicles. And an EV installed space is just a space that has that electric vehicle supply equipment connection. Tim, question from the chat. When do you anticipate the 2025 IECC will be completed and published? Adam or others who are tracking that, do you guys have a sense of when that timeline usually shakes out to be?
Yeah, I think generally the new version of the IECC is almost always released towards the end of the year prior to when it would go into effect. So I think like 2021 was released at the very end of 2020. And so I believe that they are on track, and having seen information from ICC about the development process and the finalization, it looks like they're looking to have that finalized probably towards the end of 2023.
Thank you, Adam. Okay, so that's just the terminology. And because these 3 definitions for EV capable, EV ready, and EV supply equipment were included in state statute, our understanding is that those are finite and those are what they are. So just wanted to share those with everybody so that we've got that framing in mind as we move forward to look at the different EV code options in the state. So we'll start today by looking at the 2024 proposed language. As we already shared a few of the definitions that came out of this proposed language. I'll share a little bit more detail on what the 2024 code is proposing. So within the 2024 code, there's the definition of an EV capable space, and then there are the requirements of an EV capable space, which go into a lot more detail, similar to the House Bill language. So an EV capable space must meet the following requirements within the 2024 proposed code. It must have a continuous raceway or cable assembly installed between an enclosure or outlet located within 3 feet of the space, and suitable panel board or other on-site electrical distribution equipment. So in summary, you have to have the panel capacity, and you have to have a wire that runs within 3 feet, and it ends within 3 feet of where that space would be. It means you have to have an installed raceway or cable assembly, must be sized and rated to supply a minimum circuit capacity. And that minimum circuit capacity is defined within the code language, and we'll cover that in a couple of slides. The electric distribution equipment to which the raceway or cable assembly connects shall have sufficient dedicated space and spare electric capacity for a 2-pole circuit breaker. So this is speaking specifically to the amount of electrical capacity within the panel. And then the enclosure for the outlet, and then as well as the panel, must be marked where that future electric vehicle supply equipment should be or could be installed. For commercial, specifically, residential commercial have the same requirements for EV capable, with the exception of this bullet. This bullet applies to commercial only, that the reserved capacity for the EV capable spaces shall be no less than 4.1 kVA for each space. Looking at electric readiness as the next set of requirements that are within the 2024 proposed code. Electric ready spaces shall comply with all of the requirements we just talked about for EV capable, and need to terminate in an outlet or enclosure located within 3 feet of the EV ready space it serves. They need to have that same minimum circuit capacity, which we'll share in a couple of slides, and the panel board and or other electric distribution equipment has to designate those branch circuits for future EV supply equipment installation, as well as the outlet. And Carolyn, great question in the chat. I'm just catching up. I am not sure what the 2021 proposed language looked like. So
I was just trying to figure out if they learned anything or introduced anything new from the 2021, which of course had its own story behind it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. And did I just see a hand raise? Oh, no, I must have put it back down. Okay.
There was an offer in the Q&A from Sean Denniston about his authorship of the 2024 language. So he's available as a resource, not on the board, public member.
He's with MBI.
Great.
Very knowledgeable.
I think if folks are wanting a direct answer to that question, I think I can merge him in to answer that question if folks would like us to do that.
I would certainly be interested in the response. I mean, if they're largely the same, that tells us something. If there was something introduced new into 2024, it'd be helpful to know what that was. Because there was obviously a lot of thought that went behind that addition. So I think that would be helpful.
Great, Adam. So if you want to merge Sean in, and Tim, I see your hand up, so we'll take your question while Adam's working on that.
Okay, thanks. So I can ask my question?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I was going to do this through the chat, but it might be easier. So given the differences in terms of what it appears like quite a bit more specific language in the 2024 draft, and I know the process isn't complete. What I heard this morning from Hope Medina, it's probably not going to be complete. I think, Adam, you kind of shared that. Generally speaking, potentially until the end of this year, because it's going through public comments right now. But I think it'd be important to make sure that, and I know this, I guess our hands are tied with the language in the ordinance, correct? We don't have an opportunity to change or recommend changing that language in the ordinance, I would assume.
Well, I think I would say that the state statute is the minimum requirement. So long as the definitions and the what you all decide to move forward with hit all of those points, I don't think it necessarily is limiting, as in preventing for you from considering other options. It just has to add the minimum meet all of those.
Okay, because my question's going is, from an enforcement standpoint and adopting like my jurisdiction, we're in the process going to the 21 and probably won't do the 24 for another 2 years or so. But some jurisdictions go faster than that, to where if they end up, if we have dissimilar language, and maybe Sean will help us out here in a moment to say, is there any issue between the two? And that might actually answer my question. So thank you.
Thanks, Tim. And I'm not able to figure out how to merge Sean in actually from a video perspective, but Sean, I would just encourage you to, if there are any main areas that you'd like to highlight of differences between the 2021 and 2024 language for us here in the Q&A, we're happy to take a look at it.
Adam, it looks like we might be able to allow Sean to talk. Do we want to see if we can hit that button and see if his voice can pop in?
Sure. Is that the answer live thing?
Sean, I just clicked it and I think you're muted, but let's see if you can. I see you unmuted.
So can you hear me all right?
Yes, there you are.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Dennison. I'm a senior project manager at New Buildings Institute. And yes, I helped write the 2021 and 2024 language. And so to answer that question, 2021 and 2024 language is structurally the same. And I would say that the approach is fundamentally the same. The real difference is that there have been a lot of technical advances in the language to make it more technically sound, more accurate, and more compatible with the forthcoming electrical code that is coming down the pipeline that has some changes made for electric vehicle charging. So when you look at it, you will see some differences, and they're really important differences, but EV capable is still basically the same thing. EV ready is still basically the same thing. EV SE spaces are still basically the same thing. The structure is very similar. It really does come down to these technical differences. And to the other question about exceeding the definitions in Colorado statute, because the Colorado definition of EV capable essentially aligns with what the rest of the country is calling EV ready, that's probably going to be the largest roadblock in kind of bringing the two together, because the EV capable that the rest of the country is using is more stripped down. You know, it has the raceway, it has a certain amount of capacity that it kind of depends on the situation, and it doesn't require that branch circuit like EV Ready does. So I think that that'll be the biggest challenge, is how you have what everyone else considers an EV capable space incorporated in Colorado when it doesn't meet the definition of EV capable that's in statute.
Thank you, Sean. Any follow-up questions for Sean while we've got him on the line?
So in our statute, we have the definition of what both what the charging supply needs to be, as well as what the amperage and nature of the circuit is. Is that anywhere contained within the 2024 definitions, or is it mute on that?
So that's one of the other differences between 21 and 2024. One of these technical advancements is there are no requirements in the definitions. In the building codes, that's generally not allowed. So those modifications were made, and all those requirements are put in the body of the code. So the definition just describes it in more general terms, and then the actual requirements for circuit capacity or reserved capacity or charging rate for the EVSE, those are actually all in the body of the code.
Yeah, and then within the body of the code, do they align with the state statute, or are they differ?
Generally, the big difference is that the IECC allows for a lower level of reserved capacity for EV capable spaces. And the reason for this is that it operates under the assumption that EV capable spaces, when they're finally put into service in the future, are most likely going to be load managed. They're not going to be full power as these kind of vanguard spaces that are in the code are. Those are meant for immediate use, and they may or may not be load managed, but load management is developing so rapidly that kind of made this assumption that they would be load managed. And this was for two reasons. One was just to make the code requirements a little bit easier, a little bit less costly to implement, but also because there are, depending on your utility, there can be significant issues with providing over unused capacity in a building. And so there was the general concern that if we required all this unused capacity, you would be encountering across the United States many utilities that just wouldn't allow you to do that, no matter what the code required. I don't know if Excel has any requirements like that. So, Colorado has specific circumstances, but those are the two main reasons for dropping that EV capable capacity requirement down to a lower level.
And I would just jump in too and say that because the Colorado statute doesn't necessarily weigh in on load management or sharing of infrastructure for multiple spaces, I'm not sure that necessarily the board is prohibited from including that aspect of it as well. I mean, I think that the statute is pretty clear in the definition of a minimum capacity, but it doesn't necessarily, I don't think, preclude the consideration for load management as well. So I think we might need to review that from a legal perspective just to make sure that's the case. But just throwing that out there that might also be a possibility. Did anyone else have any questions for Sean?
Tim, I see your hand raised. Yeah.
Yeah, I do. Thank you. That helped answer my questions. Mostly, Sean, I thought I heard you mention something about some of the technical changes that were done between the 21 and the 24 IECC language. I'm not sure if you said it relates back to some changes in the National Electrical Code, and if so, was that looked at with the upcoming 2023 NEC, which it's available now, and it should be adopted by the State Electrical Board about August 1st, which everyone in the state has. And I'm just trying to get my hands around making sure everything aligns.
So yes, it was the 2023 NEC was the version of the National Electrical Code that was considered. The consensus proposal that you see in 2024 right now is the result of a whole bunch of groups coming together and making a compromise that pretty much no one is happy with, but is much better than any of their individual proposals. And that process was led by NEMA, who of course plays a major role in maintaining the NEC. So we had very good representation from the electrical code community in that process.
Thank you. So just final comment, or you're asking for maybe your opinion. If potentially the board makes a proposal to, or one of us make a proposal to add in this type of language that's in the proposed draft, which probably will stay here as written through the end of the process, then that would be above and beyond the minimum. I think, as Adam said, we could do that. Would that make sense possibly, for the constituents, for Colorado jurisdictions?
I think since you're looking at statewide, it would probably make sense for them. There would be a little bit of work just in reconciling those kind of fundamental definitional differences, but that can be done in the language. The biggest risk of that is that practitioners in Colorado will then be dealing with fundamentally different terminology and requirements as everyone else, but it's a whole state. And probably most of your practitioners are working mostly within the state just because of licensing. So it may not be as big of a deal for Colorado as it might be for, say, a city that was looking at a situation like that. But it would take careful looking at the language to bring them together in a compatible way.
And Sean, can I just have you remind us what the main definitional difference is that you're identifying for the EV capable, just to make sure we're all on the same page?
Sure. The main difference really is that what the rest of the country defines as EV ready, the statute defines as EV capable. So what the rest of the country defines as EV capable doesn't really fit into the Colorado language anywhere because it's lesser than anything that Colorado has defined.
And what are the specific, like, where would you say the specific differences are? I think I heard you mention something about circuit requirements, and I don't think that's necessary. That's not in the EV capable definition. So I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page here.
So, oh, okay. So I apologize. I misread it. It looked like it said that it did require the circuit. I was reading on the fly. So I do apologize for that. I was reading quickly. It just supports the addition. So really at this point, the only difference is the amount of capacity that's required from EV capable. And then
I thought I heard you say circuit, so I just wanted to make sure that we were agreed that the EV capable did not actually require circuit.
And then the other major difference is that EV ready, the national version, just requires an outlet. And most people think an outlet is a receptacle, but outlet is a specific term in the electrical code that is receptacles and a bunch of other things. So it doesn't require a receptacle, but it looks like the Colorado version does require a receptacle.
Yes, that is in the statute. So thank you for pointing out that difference. Did anyone else have further questions for Sean before we move on? All right, Kim, back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sean. And I'm gonna oh, it looks like you're already. I'm gonna remove your permissions to talk if that's okay. Okay.
I already did.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Great. Okay. So catching back up to where we were. So I believe we were just talking about the EV ready spaces and the requirements within the 2024 proposed EV code. So again, this is requiring that EV capable, all of the EV capable pieces are in place, and then it terminates in an outlet or enclosure within 3 feet of the EV ready space that it serves. It meets the minimum circuit capacity requirements, and the panel board or other electric distribution equipment is designated for future equipment, for future electric vehicle supply equipment. So let's look at the language for EV installed within the 2024 code. So this is for the residential code, and the residential install shall comply with NFPA 70 and shall be listed and labeled according to those two UL standards you see there for 1 and 2 family dwellings and for R2 occupancies. The minimum charging rate that has to be available for the EV installed spaces have to comply with the following. Needs to be capable of charging at a rate not less than 6.2 kVA. And if the branch circuit is serving multiple EVSE spaces, EV ready spaces, or EV capable spaces, and it's designed to be controlled by an energy management system providing load management, what Sean was just referring to, it shall have a capacity of not less than 2.7 kVA. Now, there are 2 exceptions with that, the load management, and those 2 exceptions are that if a utility is not able to provide you the adequate capacity within 2 years of the building getting their certificate of occupancy, you are there's an exception there. And or if the utility can provide it, but it creates a cost differential or cost increase of more than $400 per dwelling unit, that is also an exception, an allowable exception. Looking at the commercial requirements from the 2024 draft code, each space must meet the minimum circuit capacity and charging rate requirements. We'll go through again the minimum circuit capacity in a moment. Must be located within 3 feet of each electric vehicle supply equipment space it serves. Has to be installed according to the standards you see there, and shall be accessible according to IBC section 1107. So the minimum charging rate for commercial installs shall comply with the following. Has to have a capable minimum charging rate of 6.2 kVA, or when it's serving multiple spaces and controlled by an energy management system that provides that load management, capable of simultaneously providing EV charging at a minimum rate of 3.3 kVA. And then the final thing is when serving spaces that are allowed to have a minimum circuit capacity, which is on the next slide, so we'll cover that in a moment, of 2.7, that if they're controlled by a load management system, they provide a charging rate of 2.1 kVA. Okay, now looking at the circuit capacity, the minimum circuit capacity for these two types of spaces. And let me just see, I'm checking for. Tim, that's a great question. Let me just make sure. The language, so Tim's question in the chat is the $400 per dwelling unit cost set for the owner or the utility. The actual language within the code reads, where meeting the requirements of this section will alter the local utility infrastructure design requirements on the utility side of the meter so as to increase the utility side cost to the builder or developer by more than $400 per dwelling unit. So it looks like it is a builder cost. Okay. So looking back at our minimum circuit capacity for residential, the circuit capacity minimum for all three of our space types is 8.3 kVA or 40 amps at 240 volts. And a lower capacity is allowed if the electric supply to the site is limited. For commercial, the circuit capacity is the same. And there's also a requirement for circuit capacity management. So the capacity of each branch circuit serving these different spaces designed to be controlled by that load management system needs to meet one of the following. So it either has to have the minimum capacity of 4.1 kVA per space. And then the second two bullets basically say that if all of the spaces in an R2 occupancy or in any other building site are completely covered. So you either have all electric EV ready or EV SE installed spaces, then you are allowed to provide a lower minimum capacity, and that's the 2.7 kVA. Okay. Not hearing or seeing any questions or hands up, so I'm going to continue on. I know this is a lot of very technical electrician speak, so feel free to ask if something's not clear. And then the final slide we have on the 2024 proposed code amendments for EV readiness. So this dictates the amount of EV capable, EV ready, and EV installed spaces that you must have. And interestingly enough, it seems to be one small discrepancy between the two requirements you see here. I'll explain that in a moment. So for 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses, they must have one space that is either EV capable, EV ready, or EV installed. There is no requirement on what the space type is. It just has to have one of those space types. For R2 occupancy, the residential requirements say that R2 occupancies must have one space that is EV capable, EV ready, or EV installed for 40% of each dwelling units in the building or parking spaces, whichever is less. Looking at the commercial requirements, commercial buildings, depending on their occupancy type as defined in the IBC, have to provide EV capable, EV ready, or EV installed spaces according to the percentages in the table. And the one discrepancy I noted, and I'm curious if anyone has any experience with this or understands why there's a difference here, is within the commercial requirements, R2 occupancies have 100% of the spaces covered by EV capable, EV ready, or EVSE, where the residential requirements for R2 occupancies say only 40% of those spaces must meet one of the three space types. Kristen, I see your hand up. Did you have a thought or a question?
My question was going to be, what are the gaps that you've identified? And I think you're kind of pointing to a potential discrepancy here. Basically, I just want to ascertain, are the proposed codes going to cover people regardless of where they live? Like, are there any big gaps that we're leaving out potentially?
Yeah, great question, Kristen. I have not seen any gaps within occupancy types not being covered. I think the only discrepancy that I saw within this code language is looking at the R2 occupancies and the difference in requirements between the residential and the commercial.
I think Tim had a question in the chat as well. Tim, if you wanted to ask that.
Yeah, so Tim, looks like, do the R2 spaces need to be distributed between exterior and interior spaces? I think that's a great question. I'll have to dive into the code language, and I can see, Allie, maybe you can do a little Control F and see if you can find that within the 2024 code if it specifies. I'm not sure that it does.
I feel it's mute on that topic.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. Okay. So that's all we've got for the 2024 EV Ready proposed code language. Are there any questions or thoughts that folks would like to share about the 2024 code?
Just before we do that, I would just note that Sean posted an answer in the Q&A relating to the question about the R2 differences. He said the difference is due to the fact that different committees are responsible for the residential, i.e. low-rise multifamily, and commercial, i.e. high-rise multifamily codes, and the residential committee has different inputs and folks participating. So just wanted to put that out there as the answer from Sean to that question.
Yeah, thank you, Sean, and thanks, Adam, for catching that answer. Okay. Well, if any questions come up, definitely interrupt or raise your hand. So what we're going to do now is move into a review of the residential EV Ready codes across the state of Colorado. And the next few slides summarizing the residential codes are going to be a lot less technical. We're going to speak more to the concepts within the code and how they differ or are similar as we review the residential codes. So, overview of EV Ready codes in Colorado. 17 jurisdictions have adopted EV Ready requirements. EV Ready, just where EV Ready lives within the building code, 3 of the 17 jurisdictions have adopted EV Readiness as appendixes to the code. Others have it housed in their municipal code or their land use codes. There are also a couple of jurisdictions, 2 of the 17, that have EV Ready provisions for existing buildings that include adding EV Ready spaces for additions and level 3 alterations. So Crested Butte and Louisville are our 2 that are looking at existing building requirements. So first we'll start with a review of the definitions that we've seen across the state. So for the EV Ready space, EV capable space, EV supply equipment, and EV SE installed spaces, those are very similar definitions across the state. We don't see a lot of unique language within those. EV Ready space most of them include the requirement for 40 amp panel capacity with a 240 volt branch circuit. As far as unique provisions within definitions, sections of these EV codes, Lafayette has an explicit definition for an EV load management system, and there are a couple of jurisdictions that include definitions for level 2 or level 3 chargers who call those out separately within their EV code requirements. Looking at space requirements for EV readiness, for similarly, new 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhomes have 1 EV Ready space, and that is consistent across almost all of our jurisdictions. For R2 occupancies with 3 or more units, they are usually percentage-based requirements based on the amount of parking spaces. Looking at unique provisions within the space requirements, and this is for residential, we'll talk about commercial in a moment. Lafayette and Superior have disbursement requirements for EV ready and EV capable spaces, making sure that if there are multiple buildings and multiple areas within a parking lot that serve multiple buildings, that the EV ready and EV installed spaces are distributed amongst that parking area to serve all of the buildings. For electric infrastructure, there are not really unique provisions within the code language that we reviewed, but similar provisions we've seen across the state for the different communities who have this language adopted is the 40 amp 240 volt dedicated branch circuit, that the junction box must be in close proximity, typically within 3 feet of the space or the proposed space. And that then we can see there the EV ready infrastructure is that the circuit terminates in a receptacle, a junction box, or in supply equipment. And it's labeled EV ready, that branch circuit. And then EV capable is a raceway that can accommodate a future branch circuit, and that the panel capacity and space is reserved for that future charging system. Kristen, I saw a hand go up and down. Did you have a thought or question?
I did. I was wondering if there's any requirements that at least one commercial EV space be ADA accessible.
Yeah, great question. Well, we have called out the accessibility requirements in a couple slides, so we'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, so looking at identification on construction drawings for EV spaces. Again, everything was pretty similar across the board, that EV capable, EV ready, and EV supply equipment are spaces are designated. Location is indicated for the conduit and termination points, and that the circuits are clearly identified in the electric panel board, as well as conduit for EV capable being clearly identified on construction documents. Looking at accessible parking, thanks, Kristen, for bringing this one up. Most of the jurisdictions have at least one EV ready or EV installed accessible parking space, and 7 of the 17 have accessible parking requirements that are specific for the handicap spaces. Now, Denver, and I guess we must not have captured it on this slide, Denver has, instead of assigning EV requirements to the handicap spaces, they have created a requirement around universal spaces sharing, and their requirement, as far as I understand, is that 25% of all of the EV ready spaces must be universal spaces, which means they are sized for handicapable vehicles to be able to get in and out, but they are not exclusive for handicapable vehicles. They're available and accessible to everybody. And that language was sort of pushed and helped draft by a member of the Denver City Council who is handicapable in a wheelchair. So that's sort of the way that the approach that Denver took for accessibility within their parking. Okay, a couple of other unique provisions here. So in 2 of the 17 communities that have these codes in place, they have EV system protection. So Superior and Lafayette have safety requirements in that reference the NEC. And then they also require that the construction drawings show how the receptacles will be protected from other vehicles or equipment. And then they also have language that says there must be basically a mechanism to avoid tripping, and that the charging cords can't cause trip hazards or obstruct any sidewalks or walkways. Okay, so that's our roundup on the residential EV ready codes. Any questions on those pieces? Okay, I'm not here. Oh, Carolyn, yeah.
I think the biggest thing, and maybe you'll get to this later, is just understanding how specific or how much variability you saw in the number of spaces that are allocated by category.
Yeah, great question. So what we just talked about for residential, the one EV ready space was the sort of the standard across the board. And then as we go into the EV ready commercial codes, we'll show that breakdown on how different communities are considering the space types for commercial. Okay, with that, maybe we can dive right into commercial. So again, 17 communities, all 17 that have the residential EV readiness have commercial EV readiness. This slide is very similar as far as EV readiness appendix, no change there. Those 3 communities you see have EV readiness as an appendix to their building code. Within EV readiness for existing buildings, we actually see 4 of the 17 that provide a requirement for EV readiness for existing buildings for commercial spaces when they have an addition or level 3 alteration. So Crested Butte, Fort Collins, Louisville, and Superior all require some EV ready if there's a major addition or level 3 alteration. So looking again at definitions. Yeah, Tim, did you have a question on that last slide?
A question or a comment, I guess. So that you're referring to level 3 alterations. Is that level 3 that is listed in the IECC that you're referring to?
Yes, that is.
Thank you.
Yep. Sorry, I muted myself. Okay, so for definitions, again, we have similar definitions across the board for EV ready, EV capable, EV supply equipment, and EV installed spaces. There were no differences within the definitions listed between residential and commercial. So same there. As far as unique provisions, again, we have the EV load management system defined by Lafayette and Fort Collins. Jurisdictions define level 2 and level 3. And on this slide, we pulled in a couple of those examples so you guys could see. Avon has a definition for a level 2 charger. And then Denver has a definition for a DC fast charger. And then their DC fast charger definition differed the most from the rest of the definitions that we saw for fast charging. So that definition from Denver says equipment capable of charging on a 100 amp or higher 480 volt 3-phase branch circuit. AC power is converted to DC. And then generally for the other folks that had a level 3 definition, so Lafayette is one among others, they define a fast charger as any vehicle supply equipment with a minimum power output of 20 kilowatts. So those are the 2 core differences in the DC fast charging definitions that we saw throughout the requirements. Fort Collins includes definitions for affordable housing and permanent supportive housing. Both of those have been included as definitions in Fort Collins's code because there are specific EV readiness requirements for those building types. And then Louisville distinguishes between private restricted use and public use of chargers. So looking at the space requirements, Carolyn, this should hopefully answer your question. So there are different options that communities have pursued as far as looking at how they designate their space requirements for commercial. So it's either, what we've seen is either really occupancy as dictated by community specific building types or by the IBC occupancy types, and or parking space totals are the ones that determine the EV ready space requirements. And some communities have both occupancy and parking space totals. Some just have parking spaces and some just have occupancy types, and all assign EV capable, EV ready, and EV installed spaces by a percentage of spaces. So what changes between jurisdictions, again, is the percentages assigned to each type, and if those percentages are dictated by occupancy or total space types. Unique features there that we saw, there were a couple of communities that had features such that they could reduce the amount of EV installed spaces if they included a fast charger, or they could reduce the amount of EV ready spaces if they added more EV installed spaces, things like that. So there were trade-offs built into a couple of the code language that allowed community or builders to basically adjust the percentages based on the types of chargers that they wanted to install. Adam.
I think first, I just want to make sure, Carolyn, did that answer your question wholly, or did you have additional elements to your question?
No, I mean, I think it'd be really helpful to see kind of ultimately, it's obviously going to be some count or some percentage of each. And if there's seems to be an area of strong consistency, that's just helpful. That's all.
Yeah, I've got 2 more slides to continue on this to show you kind of where the distribution falls. So
yeah, and maybe once we're done with that, Kim, I would also suggest that since we have a number of folks representing jurisdictions that have done these, we might, be able to ask them how they made their decision when they put these into their codes, if they are interested in sharing.
yeah, absolutely. It's a great idea, Adam. Excuse me. Okay, so again, to outline how these space requirements are being dictated. So there are 3 sort of formulas that we saw within the code language. Percentages based on occupancies from the IBC or based on their own community-specific building types. Percentages based on a total parking count, and then percentages based on both. And typically for that 3rd category, the split was between R2 occupancies and all other groups. So that's how we see those getting split out. So the most common that we saw is 7 communities have percentages based on total parking count. 5 of our communities have that split with both. So it goes total parking count, but breaks up R2 occupancies separate from the rest of the occupancy types. And then 4 of our communities have percentages based on specific building types or specific building occupancies. So just to show a quick example of what these look like, and I'll say there was a couple of communities that had consistency between themselves, but generally speaking, they were kind of all over the map. So this is an example of Avon, from Avon looking at just the amount of parking spaces and the total parking spaces provided for a project and how that breakdown might look. And they also, we included them here because they also have a one of those unique provisions that says the number of EV supply equipment installed may be reduced up to 5 if they provide, if a fast charger is provided. Here's an example from Louisville of what the space requirements look like if you are, oops, and I think I mixed up the titles on this one. This one is for, the example is for occupancies. The last slide I showed was for total parking spaces. So this is looking at different building types within the city of Louisville and assigning percentages based on those building types. And then finally, this is an example pulled from Summit County. This is pretty much what all of the language looked like that split out R2 occupancies with the rest. So there were usually 2 tables, one specific for R occupancies and one specific for the rest of the IBC occupancies. So to Adam's suggestion, I would love to open the floor up, and I'll move back here. I think we've got, I know we've got Boulder County, we've got Fort Collins and others on the call. If anyone wants to share their rationale and why they chose the direction that they chose for their community, we would love, I'm sure the board would love to hear that. Carolyn, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think it was clear that when we made a transition with our last code update to create that higher percentage for R2 occupancies. Again, acknowledging that those are the locations where vehicles are going to be parked for longer durations, and that access to home charging is kind of the priority. And so that's why we selected a higher share of charging infrastructure for the R2 occupancies as opposed to commercial. I will note, and I'll be curious to see, we certainly talked extensively about creating flexibility based on charging type and allowing builders to come in. We didn't explicitly call it out in code, but I do think that was something important to us as well, to try and encourage more fast charging at the commercial sites in particular. So that was our transition.
Thank you, Caroline. Ron.
Yeah, so I excuse me, we chose parking spaces primarily because we thought it was going to be easy to administer. That was really a driving factor there. But during those discussions, the one piece that we talked a lot about, and I don't know that we actually solved anything, but we were very aware that a lot of people were hesitant to embrace EVs fully because of the range anxiety that would come with longer distance regional travel. And so while we didn't quite solve it, we were really trying to think of how do we encourage more of the fast chargers in the locations where people would be traveling through to try and reduce some of that regional range anxiety. I still think that that's probably an important piece. People seem to find ways to, to get EV charging in their sort of daily use locally. But when we start talking about being the primary vehicle for a family and traveling around, all of a sudden the network of high-speed chargers becomes much more important for really full deep adoption into our community. So that was something we would really I think still be interested in trying to see is how do we make sure we get a dense network of high-speed charging to really help solve that.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Appreciate you sharing. Jason, love to hear your experience with Crested Butte.
Yeah, kind of piggyback off of Ron, we have a lot of that anxiety and kind of supercharged the fact that we're a tourist, economy, have a lot of people that are coming in that are perhaps, at a hotel or renting a short-term rental in a short-term rental. And so being able to provide a fast charger, a DC fast charger, 25 watts is kilowatts was important for us because, first of all, we don't have very many level 3 alterations or new commercial buildings left. We're pretty built out. And so, I'm kind of looking through all the codes of the, various examples. And I think we're on the end of, the most aggressive, because we're at the end of the road and it's really important to be able to provide that charging opportunity. And also because we're a smaller community with less built out or less to build out.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And then Brad, I didn't know if you wanted to share any of your experience with Fort Collins, but
yeah, I'd be happy to. We kind of, really piggybacking on what was already said, but really we looked at the emphasis being on multifamily, and the biggest driver for that was we're starting to see a shift in the city of Fort Collins as a move towards more multifamily housing. We're starting to see a slight decrease in the number of single family homes, detached and attached, that are permitted, and an increase in the number of multifamily properties. Also recognizing that it's a lot easier to install this in a single family home. And we've heard from some developers, I can think of two specifically on some projects that we have going in town, that they want to definitely were encouraged by us considering multifamily EV charging options. They don't want to be excluded from this. So developers coming in building large multifamily projects, parking structures as well, want this within their development. So that was a big factor in us. We did sort of align with the occupancies within the International Building Code. That's just kind of where we fell. It made sense to us that those building classifications were already defined. So that was the decision making for us.
Awesome. Thank you, Brad. Does anyone have any questions of the folks who have done this work? Rick, yeah, go for it.
Thanks, Kim. Hello, everyone. It's Rick Garcia, the Dole Executive Director. I'm just curious, as I hear the thinking, the planning thinking that went into devising these options. I'm curious, as we look at multifamily zoning as it relates to parking spaces, we're always, in in a local planning function, trying to balance the true accessibility to other mobility options with those who wouldn't own a car or need a permanent space, therefore reducing the number of actual parking spaces. And I'm curious in the thinking, that these communities have put forth, we obviously want to see an increase in electric vehicle ownership and utilization. In theory, those kinds of vehicles are not contributing to the overall greenhouse gas issues that we're challenged with. So are we thinking, or are you thinking that in the long run we might be seeing more spaces for electric vehicles primarily as increased ownership occurs, therefore kind of creating a footprint with future developments that may require more land space to accommodate the number of electrical vehicles parking spaces that folks in the future, and this probably relates more to permanent residents as opposed to temporary tourism-based economies like guest part-time residents coming in and out of a community. So if you understand my question, I'm just kind of curious. It's it's kind of rhetorical, but I'm just interested if we're thinking about that in the years to come.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. I think that's a fantastic question, and I saw a bunch of hands raised. So Carolyn, and then Chris, and then we'll go to Brad.
Yeah, our answer from the Boulder perspective is no, we're not planning to give more parking spaces. I think we're still consistent in trying to move towards multimodal options, particularly, in areas where we have zones specifically to encourage multimodal options. So, but you hit on the point of why such a high percentage of at least EV ready or EV capable spaces within multifamily properties was so important. Is within the constrained parking, you do want to make sure that there is access to charging spaces for the people who do own vehicles. So that's where we were at.
Thanks, Carolyn. And Chris.
Yeah, thanks. Just to kind of maybe align with Carolyn, from my perspective, it's about, multimodal and VMT reduction obviously continues to be important. And when we're thinking about parking spaces, it's more about just anticipating continued parking needs, per unit or individual, and recognizing that most of the vehicle fleet will turn over and electrify during the lifespan of new buildings. So it's about, anticipating the types of vehicles that people will have in the lifetime of that building and doing, lower cost upfront interventions that will save money and allow those individuals to have the types of vehicles that they will end up gravitating towards anyway.
Thanks, Chris. Brad, pass it to you.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, so we chose to align our requirements with the number of required parking spaces. And the reason that we chose to do that was, and those required parking spaces are set within our land use code. And the reason we chose to do that was we have a provision for what we call transit-oriented design that allows you a reduction in the number of parking spaces. So trying to encourage, understanding that there is an additional cost with the EV infrastructure, and trying to encourage them to build, and also knowing that build within a transit-oriented design area. And then also knowing that we were kind of adapting our land use code to our housing strategy or housing plan to encourage greater density within the city of Fort Collins. So we're trying to encourage more of that building within that transit-oriented area.
Brad, help me out. What's your community?
City of Fort Collins.
Okay.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that perspective, Brad. Jason.
Crested Butte's also trying to limit the amount of vehicles and parking requirements. Our new affordable housing unit that's going to be going in, 34 units, will be encouraging, we'll be having a car sharing, EV car sharing opportunity there. And Yeah, as Carolyn mentioned, we're also trying to incentivize multimodal.
Thanks, Jason. Rick, does that give you the context you were looking for?
Yeah, I think it helps. I mean, obviously there's not one silver bullet in this whole process, but it's an area of interest as we think more from a state perspective in our affordable housing agenda, you know, what the future might hold relative to trying to support eliminating parking spaces that maybe are not necessary. So this is helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that great question, Rick. There any other questions from folks for the folks we've got on the board who have gone through this process and had the tough discussions? Anyone? Chris, I'm guessing your hand is still up from your comment earlier. Yep, awesome.
I just have one thing to add. I remember from an earlier conversation, or in the conversation about what the utilities will do, and we certainly had this code in place for a while, and there has been some pushback, but also ultimate concession from the utility regarding the service capacity needs that are triggered by the code. So just knowing that has been in play in several of these communities for some time, particularly again on our multifamily properties because of our higher number of ready and capable spaces. But it is something that we should consider as a board.
And Carolyn, you guys are working with Excel, is that correct?
That is correct. Excel is our electric utility.
Okay, thanks. I think I saw Brad and then Kevin, or Kevin and then Brad. Either way, doesn't matter.
Sure, either way. A quick question for maybe Brad, Ron, and Chris. Have you encountered any issues with space bumping up against minimum requirements? And this would be probably more of an urban infill where you're in a sub-grade garage, and often, you know, like a Denver lot's 125. By the time you get in there, you're really tight on your drive lane with. How are your municipalities handling situations where the charging stations themselves are starting to encroach on the required space for the parking, for the required parking space clearances?
I'll sort of address that, and then I'll mention what I was going to bring up to the group. But we actually haven't seen. I think for the most part, a lot of our development comes in, especially when you're talking about a parking garage. Most of what gets proposed at time of plan review, they almost always exceed the number of required parking spaces for some reason. So we haven't seen anybody comment on this being a reduction, having to reduce the number of parking spaces. They've been pretty easily able to accommodate, and prior to our 2021 code, we had a provision in that so that they had to bring in some empty conduit. And I've been in some of those structures, and it was really easily accommodated. It didn't take up much space at all. So we haven't heard that from the building community at all. The only other thing I would add would be that we had some significant discussion with some community members, some groups, and affordable housing partners in Fort Collins, and a lot of discussion around underutilized parking within our affordable housing developments. So that was a pretty contentious issue, and that's why you see the result of our affordable housing stuff and what we call permanent supportive housing. Permanent supportive housing is really defined as people that are strictly mobility challenged. They're not going to be driving a vehicle, yet there are still parking spaces that are required in there, but very unlikely that they'll see many vehicles parking within those spaces at all.
Thanks, Brad. Awesome. Any other thoughts or questions for our folks on the board? And if not, we've got a couple more slides on the commercial EV readiness stuff. Okay. Not seeing any hands, but as always, just raise your hand if a thought comes to mind. So continuing on along with that same theme as the residential, for accessible parking, again, we see a similar provision across the jurisdictions that one of the accessible handicap spaces is EV ready, EV capable, or EV installed. And then the 7 of the 17, again, have accessible parking requirements. And the same is true here as was for residential, that Denver has the universal space requirements that address accessibility. Looking specifically at additions and alterations. So similar to the residential, EV ready requirements apply to major additions and alterations, mostly level 3 alterations where the work area exceeds 50% of the original building square footage. And that is how level 3 is defined within the code. So for communities have the provisions to include spaces for additions and level 3 alterations. And Crested Butte and Fort Collins are on our call, as you all know. So if you guys have any questions specific to this piece, I'll pause and see if there are any hands here. Okay. Yeah, Tim.
Good deal. Yeah, thank you. I know I asked this question just a little while ago for clarification on level 3 or level 2 alterations, and got the answer that was in the IECC. And I was just relooking at my 21 IECC and got the 2 sections, residential and commercial, for existing buildings, and they don't have different levels. So the different levels of alterations, especially what you're pointing out here, the 50%, is coming out of the International Existing Building Code, and the IEBC specifically does not apply to resident RC projects, just to make the point for clarification for everybody.
Thanks, Tim. And so I guess for Fort Collins or Crested Butte, do you guys want to, if anyone wants to speak to, the alignment with the IBC for that level 3 alteration? I'm scanning that IECC right now as well. And I think you're right, Tim, that's not referenced within this code. Carolyn?
Yeah, actually, I had a question for either Fort Collins or Crested Butte on this one, because when you think about installing raceway in particular, not all level 3 alterations are going to trigger like a redo of a parking surface or garage. And so I was just curious how this has been working out and what kind of pushback you may have gotten or experienced on this. I think we've often thought about if you're resurfacing parking as a trigger point, as opposed to or if you are you breaking it up so that if there's electrical alterations that are happening, they're taking care of that piece versus the installation of the raceway.
Brad?
Oh, I think that's a really good point, Carolyn. And I think for that very reason, we just kept it pretty basic and simple. So really defining it, not even using the language of a level 3, but just an alteration where the work exceeds 50% or more of the building square footage. And we just left it at that. Typically, we have seen some change to parking areas in renovations and alterations that size. I don't know that we've seen anything yet. We adopted the 2021 code in April. We were still wrapping up a lot of 2018 projects, probably well into the summer. So we're just now starting to see some of these projects fall and come through plan review. I can't think of anything that I've seen yet that has addressed this. So the only other thing I was thinking earlier that I might be worthwhile including, but we have some provisions within code for spaces where they are quick transaction spaces. I used it famously, I got a lot of flack for it, but in our addressing city council, I brought it up that we considered spaces like Little Caesars Pizza. So where people are coming in and it's a 5-minute transaction, they're not parking in those spaces for any more than a few minutes at a time. a dry cleaner or something like that. So would be worth considering maybe.
Yeah, and Jason, if you wanted to add.
Yeah, not much to add, but ours was quite simple as well. Work area exceeding 50% for a level 3 alteration. But I take Carolyn's point, if it's not, it could be a significant barrier if you're not, ripping up asphalt already and it's just, somewhere in the back and it doesn't really, you're not actually getting into where you'd have that, run that cable and the I could see that being an issue, and thanks to Brad as well to figure out what might be considerations, or if people want to appeal because it's a Little Caesars pizza and it's a 5-minute transaction. I think those are all really good questions to ask.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Okay, awesome. Any other questions on the alterations or additions, or any other thoughts? Okay. Continuing on for the requirements we see in commercial code language for circuit capacity. There are provisions that ensure that there's enough electric infrastructure. The most common rated capacity is 8.3 kVA, 40 amp with a 240 volt circuit. And that aligns with the 2024 IECC. For circuit capacity management, the commercial 2024 IECC and Denver 2022 proposal both add in energy management systems, so sort of separate requirements for energy management system to manage the load of all of the chargers. Adam.
Just going back to the point that Brad made about certain building types and what parking, timeliness of parking that will be used. We got a question from our viewers about probably directly to Brad, or when you have these when you're taking into account who will be spending how much time in a particular parking space for particular businesses, are those buildings being built specifically with those businesses in mind, or are you still factoring in the possibility that something else might replace it in a few years that might require longer term parking?
Yeah, it's a good question. It is something that we did think about, and we realized we really have almost no control over what that building may become 10 years down the road. So you really just have to address it at the time of construction or at the time of the alteration.
Thanks, Brad.
Yeah, and Ron, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say that we actually did talk about that particular problem a little bit, just being that, change of use of businesses is already a little bit complicated for many small business owners. And that's why one of the reasons why we also like the sticking to just the number of parking spots, because it just kept that from getting further challenging, because it was just already a spot where we have a lot of struggles with local business owners who are trying to change a business use just a little bit. And that's a good example, going from a Little Caesars pizza, so someplace that you're maybe eating in the restaurant. They think of it as a fairly simple change, but now if you start layering these additional requirements, it can get expensive quickly.
Ron, can I ask a clarifying question on that? I think you're referring to like the balance of the commercial, not necessarily the R2s, right?
That's
like
correct.
An R2 doesn't materially change into Little Caesars.
That's correct.
Awesome. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Carolyn. Okay, so that really concludes the overview for EV ready codes that we see across the state. And I know you guys all have that resource, that wonderful resource that Adam put together that details all of the specific code language that each of the communities have adopted. So I just want to open it up now. General comments, questions, discussion points before we move on to our next agenda item, which will be really how we're gonna how we propose to reach all of our decisions as a board and our proposed process. So before we move on to that, just want to make sure any thoughts, questions, ideas around EV readiness are aired while we've got time. Andrew.
Andrew Harris, looking at the 2024 draft residential R40474, there are exceptions, which I anticipated there would be draft exceptions. One of them, exception number 1, states where the local electric distribution entity is certified in writing that it is not able to provide 100% of the necessary distribution capacity within 2 years after the estimated date of the CO. That's along lines of some of my prior concerns raised. Is if you seen in any of the other adopted or draft variations of this, how this may actually be executed and how a process may look. For somebody who operates in a community where there's multiple communities within a larger community, that how might these exceptions work?
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm gonna just make sure I understand your question. Are you kind of posing the question of how would someone within the building code prove out these exceptions?
Maybe that's part of the question. It could be multiple parts. Are the exceptions sufficiently well developed that they actually capture wholly some of the obstacles that one may present? 2, as drafted, yes, how might it actually be executed or implemented, and what would be necessary for a decision to be made? 3, when it comes to distribution capacity, I know that the code itself, or at least the statute, talks about adequate panel capacity, and that itself is still a question, because panel capacity leads to distribution capacity, and how all this gets looked at as, in the way is drafted in the model code, it's an exception. Whether it's an exception or a consideration, I think there's still things that have to be addressed. And I just didn't know if anybody in the group has, or any of the other jurisdictions that have attempted to go down this road so far, how it's been addressed.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone on the board has any experience with exceptions when it comes to the available electric capacity that the utility is able to provide. These 2 exceptions, hopefully you guys can see. Can you guys see the code language? Okay. Are listed here, and these are specific exceptions within the circuit capacity requirements for the 2024 residential. Yeah, Ron.
I was just going to say that so far we have not had any customers raise this kind of a question to date.
And it would typically be Ron who would deal with it if it came up. I mean, that we always come up with issues that the chief building official would have to resolve a disposition, and they have that capability.
Okay, thanks, guys. Tim?
I've got a question, and you pulled this up. Which code is this draft language coming out of, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the draft code language for the 2021 IECC draft. And this is within that resource that Adam put together for us. So this is the residential draft language, and this is under the circuit capacity.
I see. Okay, thank you. And then that kind of leads me to a second question then. The potential, maybe the potential requirements for putting in tables of required numbers of EV spaces, is that something that is going to be on the table for the board, which would be above and beyond the minimum language? Is that how I'm kind of seeing where this discussion is going?
Yeah, Kim, I don't know if you want to respond to Tim or if you have a second question.
I have a separate comment. So.
Okay. So Tim, yes, I think we see that one of the board's responsibilities will be to basically create that table, a table that or multiple tables that dictates the amount of EV capable, EV ready, and EV installed spaces, whether that be for commercial buildings or R2 occupancies.
So that is in some part of the ordinance or the language that was adopted to that's our charge. I'm sorry.
Yes, and actually, I could sneak ahead to one of our when we go through the decisions that we must make. But one of the decisions, as written in statute, is that the board must allocate for commercial spaces at least 20%. I believe it's 20%. Adam, is that right? Of the total spaces must be EV ready, EV capable, or EV installed. Now, the board, again, as Adam alluded to earlier, that is the minimum that the state statute assigns. So the board is welcome to go beyond that 20% threshold, but that is the minimum that the board will be responsible for.
Okay, yeah, I didn't get probably to the reread towards the back of that language. I posted up on the chat the current language in the 2021 IBC, which I'm pretty certain is going to stay about the same in the 24 IBC, for required number of the EV parking spaces, and point out that they're currently under the 21 as an exception that R2, which is multifamily, R3 and R4s don't have to provide any EV. So of course that'd be less restrictive than the state law, but just to point that out.
Thanks, Tim. Kim, I'll go to you, and then Andrew, we can maybe circle back and make sure we got your question answered. So go for it, Kim.
Great, thanks. I just actually had an additional comment to hopefully address Andrew's question. Down here in my region, it's just San Miguel and Uray counties. We are served by San Miguel Power Association, which is under Tri-State. And we are working on a regional EV readiness plan to plan for the change to EVs across the next 10 years. And we've been interviewing everybody, including and working with SMPA staff members. And we asked in multiple different ways whether SMPA foresaw any sort of capacity or limitations in what they would be able to serve for both EV capacity as well as then electrification of buildings. And we were assured that from what they could foresee so far, that there was plenty of capacity and that wouldn't be a limitation. So the only locations where it might be a situation that they would need to resolve that they were looking at was, I think, the case of load management. That's tool was brought up as a way to address anything, but also at like the end of a street in a neighborhood, if all of the houses all at once increased or installed an EV charger, that then they might need to change out the transformer. So that was kind of the only thing that they saw that would need to be a change related to EV charging across the region. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Adam, pass it to you.
I have kind of a two-part question. I guess I would ask Ron and the other building officials on the call, Tim and others. So presuming that a building is constructed to be either EV capable or EV ready, that if at the point when EVSE infrastructure would actually be installed later on, I assume that would probably require some separate permit or other authorization from the building department. And so I guess my question then is, I'm seeing head nods, which is why I'm moving on through my question. My question would then be, would setting them, even in the situation where a utility has certified that it can't meet the distribution requirements, does that preclude from saying you still have to be at least EV capable or EV ready? And then of course, you know, if the utility still at the point when the building owner is wanting to install that EV charging infrastructure, then the building department could then resolve that situation down the road. But I don't know if that necessarily precludes the installation of EV capable or EV ready. So I would just be curious as to hearing folks' thoughts on that part.
I guess I would say that depending on the device installed, if there's a receptacle in the parking area, some of these EVSE equipment are just simply fully listed plug-in devices, in which case there wouldn't be a building permit associated with that in Boulder County.
Thanks, Ron. Tim, did you want to answer that as well?
Yeah, I agree with Ron, and I had posted a comment earlier in the chat about the EV permits that we've been doing, quite a few of them actually, and I think Tesla is one of the manufacturers, and they don't use the receptacle. It's a hardwired system, which that requires the permit, so we're getting the permit. And with the Broomfield EV ordinance that went in place about 6 months ago, we made that comment to make sure that that language was taken out to require a receptacle and just require it to be the circuit to be taken there and then with a junction box. So in that case, in either case, we need a permit, but I don't know if we'd ever be reaching out to our XL or United Power to make sure they've got the capacity though. Is that part of what that question was?
Yeah, I mean, I think the purpose of the exception here is that the utility throughout the process of design or construction is telling the proposed project or the under construction project that, you know, we know you have to build to this code, but we can't meet your service requirements, your distribution requirements. That's my understanding as to what this exception is getting at. And so I guess my question is more geared towards in a situation where the utility does send that, you know, certification in writing to the project owner, then in that situation, could you still require at least a minimum of EV capable or EV ready? Because it would still, in most cases, it sounds like, you know, Ron, I think you mentioned an exception, and maybe that's something that would need to be addressed down the road, but that you could still at least require those that don't necessarily draw electricity that would require that distribution capacity immediately. And then there's a separate phase where if that situation persists, then you deal with that at the point of installation of the charging infrastructure itself. So I guess that was the purpose of my question.
Yeah, and my answer to you would be yes, you would still want to make sure the raceway was installed and that there were spots in the panel for when the service could be brought in, you know, very much for that future use case. And then again, I think the only place we've encountered any issues is not on any of the commercial requirements, the smaller percentages of spaces. It's in the multifamily where like half the spaces have to have service capacity. So that's where it's triggering.
Thanks, Carolyn. And I did want to call attention to Ted's question in the Q&A, and Ron, this might be one for you. Does any place in unincorporated Boulder County have any master planned communities in development, which might trigger, you know, this exception and the point made by Andrew?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Thanks, Ron. Okay, awesome. Thanks, Andrew, for that question, and hopefully that started to get to the answer. It sounds like most utilities that have been working on this are not concerned about that as a potential issue. Not to say that it wouldn't be in the future, but Adam, did you have another thought you wanted to share?
Didn't necessarily have another thought. I just wanted to let you all know that I have to jump off temporarily to go to another meeting. So if you have any questions that are directed at me, I will be rejoining later. So please hold on to those and I will be back.
Thanks, Adam. We'll see you soon. Okay. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Uh-oh.
You're just going to need to make another recording, Kim.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Okay, let's go ahead. There we go. Okay. We'll figure out how to merge these videos later. Any other final thoughts, questions, ideas that you guys want to discuss while we've got some time today? All right, I'm not hearing any, so we'll move on to the next part of our agenda, which is going to be to cover So there's two parts, and I'm going to pass it to Allie to share all of this detail. So the first section is going to be reviewing all of the decisions that are listed within state statute that the board is responsible for. So if you guys have any questions or thoughts, we can go back and reference the state statute. But as far as our understanding and interpretation of the state statute, the decisions that we'll present are the ones that we must make as a board. Then, after we review the decisions that we need to make, we'll take you through our meeting schedule for the rest of the meetings and discuss how we expect to move through all of these decisions that need to be made. At which point, once we've gone through that process, we'll open it up because we would love to hear your guys' thoughts and feedback. We want to make sure this process is as amenable to you guys and what you need to make these decisions as possible. So with that, I will pass it off to Allie.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, so just to zoom back out, the duty of the Energy Code Board per statute is to develop that model ready, electric ready and solar ready code for adoption across the state. And so the next steps as a group will be to lay out the decisions that we're going to have to make to reach that final code. And we've pulled out all of the major decisions we'll make through the process into the three main categories of buildings as identified by the statute, which are residential, small commercial and multifamily, which is less than 10,000 square feet, and large commercial and multifamily, which is over that 10,000 square feet. And then again, we'll leave some time at the end of this section for you guys to ask any clarifying questions and let us know if we've missed anything in these decisions. Next slide. So starting with residential, decision one is the same for all these categories. We all have to decide on the solar ready code requirements for each of these building categories. Decision two for residential is strictly EV ready and EV capable requirements. Decision three will be electric ready requirements for these mixed fuel residences, with the note that we're looking for to develop a way to ensure the most cost-effective process. I note that there are no variances in this for residential buildings. Decision four might get a little bit more complicated here. It's developing the process to waive requirements if and when there are natural disasters. And so we'll have to decide on things like the timeline after a disaster hits and any other circumstances that might qualify for this process waiver. Next slide. And then for these smaller commercial and multifamily buildings, again, decision one is the same solar ready code requirements. Decision two is a little bit different. We're locking down the EV ready, EV capable, and EV supply equipment requirements, knowing that the state statute, as we mentioned before, is that 20% or more parking spaces has to fall into one of these. Decision three, again, is the electric ready requirements for mixed fuel with the same note about cost effectiveness. And decision four, finally, is also that similar process for waiving requirements for when there's a natural disaster. So next, large commercial and multifamily buildings. Again, decision one is solar ready code requirements. Decision two is also essentially the same for this as the small commercial and multifamily, same requirement for 20% or more of the vehicle parking spaces, which we will decide as a board. And then decision three is where it kind of breaks from the smaller one, and that's state statute is requiring large mixed fuel buildings to reach some version of this electric ready while also accounting for cost effectiveness. And then next slide, there's a little bit more about that before we jump into decision four. The state statute wants to acknowledge that there's like a need to expand on what that kind of means. And so they want us to develop clear guidelines to accompany the model code that will help builders, building owners, and developers towards minimizing costs while ensuring they're able to electrify cost effectively. Next slide. And then decision 4 is 2 parts here. We have to make a decision about what cost differential will constitute a need or ability for someone to get a variance or waiver on electric and solar ready codes, as well as what that process will look like for builders, developers, building owners to request one. Again, noting here that the cost effectiveness piece applies to electric and solar ready and EV ready, and this sort of variance process applies for this large commercial and multifamily and not residential or small commercial and multifamily. Next slide. And then finally, we have the same decision to make on the how to waive requirements if and when there are natural disasters declared. And then the same circumstances, same decision around circumstances and timeline and other considerations. Pause here. Does anyone have questions, comments? Have we missed any major decisions here? All right. Hearing none so far. We'll leave some time at the end as well. Oh, yeah, Kevin.
Given the number of engineers and that kind of minded folks on the call, any chance this is available on a matrix? Just for a quick look at all of them.
Yes, I believe it is.
Thanks.
Yeah, we can share that after the meeting. Anyone else? Cool. Should we just dive into the meeting plan then? Does that sound good? All right. If we could go to the next slide. We're expecting 11 total meetings with some flexibility to add somewhere wherever we might need. But again, the goal of this process and meeting plan is to make sure we're getting the board through all of the information and discussion that we need to decide on all the necessary code elements. Knowing that, if we don't make those decisions by April 1st, the decision goes to the executive committee. So with that, next slide, meetings 1 through 4, which we have basically gone through, is the overview of all the different code elements and what's being done currently in the state. And then over the course of the next 4 meetings, we are going on deep dives into the different code elements to sort of get out all of that discussion component. We will expect all of you to come prepared to make decisions on these various code, to discuss these various code elements, so that we stay on track to wrap up code development on time, and hopefully we don't have to turn these things over to the executive committee. And so the goal of these meetings is to get out all the information and discussion and let everyone air their thoughts so that we on the Lotus team are in a position to draft the code language based on your input, with room for a little bit of follow-up in the following meeting for any final questions or discussion. And again, we have a little bit of wiggle room, so we can add meetings where necessary. Next slide.
Tim, did you have a question first?
Yeah, thank you. So I recall early on talking about hopefully getting some, I guess, summary of potential cost ramifications of various potential amendments or requirements. So that's one question, if we would be able to have that before start the next meeting. And then a second would be, I think, from my standpoint, but I think maybe the rest of the board members, if it would be possible, like for each meeting, to have maybe a list of some potential recommendations from Lotus to say, here's maybe starting out of the gate a framework, and then we as a board could be more efficient, I think, in terms of just going through and say, this looks good, or this looks good, modify it, this doesn't look good, and maybe do the votes as we go through there. And in a 3-hour meeting for solar ready commercial and both large and small commercial, I think that'd help us get through that process in 3 hours?
Yeah, absolutely. Tim, Allie, if you don't mind hopping in here. So for the cost study summary, we will have that ready by the 5th meeting. So by January 23rd, we can plan to present the summary of, so meeting 5 will be solar ready, and then we'll go EV ready, electric ready, and then the variants. So we can plan to present the cost summary information on solar readiness, since you guys won't maybe have had time to review that summary report in full. So you have all the information you'll need. And then, yeah, absolutely. To your point, that will be our goal for each one of these meetings, 5 through 8, we'll start with the most common framework or a recommendation. We are bringing on Shums Coda as our sort of technical support with this code language development. So we'll work with them to figure out what's the best starting place for each one of these. And then, as Allie mentioned, we'll be able to present that to you guys and then have that more deep dive discussion on pieces you like of the recommendation, pieces you don't, all of that. So yeah, fantastic recommendation, Tim. That's definitely our plan. Carolyn.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, I like the order in which you have this, because I think solar ready is the easiest. And then EV ready is slightly harder. And then the electric ready, when we talk about the large commercial, is going to be the most challenging. So it warms us up. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think electric readiness we're expecting, because there are the 3 components, the residential, small commercial and multifamily, and large commercial multifamily. We anticipate some of the conversation around large multifamily to bleed into that 8th meeting, where we will have the conversation around electric ready and the variants for those larger buildings. Okay. Thanks, Allie.
Sure. Thank you. Any other questions? Cool. Okay. So yeah, given all of that, we're hoping that meetings 9 and 10 can essentially be a line-by-line vote on the code language that we have developed based on your input from those previous 8 meetings. And so we'll be sharing that ahead of time. And then during the meeting is the time that we will spend the time to vote and answer questions, make final comments and changes. And so please make sure you're making time before those meetings to review the language that we send out, so that we're not spending the meeting time, everyone's valuable meeting time, reviewing language. And then finally, meeting 11 is the variance methodology. And so we'll again be preparing that and sharing that ahead of time. And so again, please review that make some time to review that ahead of time so that we can focus the meeting on any questions, comments, and the voting. And then a reminder that all code language and variance methodology should earn a 2/3 vote to pass. Otherwise, we will turn it over to the executive committee to decide. Yeah, so that's the plan. So yeah, Tim.
Yeah, so I assume that there will be review and input by the state attorney. I'm sorry, I don't recall his name. Before we are able to vote on a set of language. Sorry.
That's a good question, Tim, and I wish Adam would come back. So let's hold that question until Adam pops back on the call. I'm not sure if the Energy Office will do that legal review after the vote on the final language or prior to. And I would imagine if it's after, that any issues that are flagged by the attorneys will then go to the executive committee. Ron?
This is David. Can I just chime in real quick and say, it's my intention to work with you all throughout this whole process so that we don't get to the point where you all have approved something and then we get a red flag. So that's why I'm attending these meetings. So please speak up. Yeah.
Thank you,
Ask
David.
Yes,
I didn't realize you were on the call as well. Awesome. And then over to Ron.
I was just going to ask for David's opinion on that. Thank you.
Perfect. And I guess I do just also want to emphasize for meetings 9 and 10, we're going to need to vote on every single element of these code packages. And so what we've seen in the past is if folks don't come prepared with their specific edits, their very specific thoughts on the code language, that it leads to more discussion, and then you run out of time to vote on everything. So in order to just be respectful of the rest of the Energy Code Board members and to make sure that everybody has a chance to vote on everything without it going to the executive committee, we really want to emphasize that you guys come prepared to those meetings. Our goal in setting up, the solar ready, EV ready, electric ready, and the variance methodology in our meetings 5 through 8, we're going to then go through in meetings 9 and 10. We'll start with solar ready. We'll then move to EV ready and so on and so forth. The intention there was to make sure that our team has enough time to draft the code language, to run it through our technical advisors, and to get it to you guys with our goal is going to be 2 weeks with between 1 to 2 weeks advance time. So you have time to review that language. Tim.
So with those 2 meetings, each one being approximately 3 hours apiece, as we know, and for efficiency, I think you pointed out made some good points. Is there a way to kind of set up a more rigid time process? I know we're not operating under Robert Rules of Orders like we do at the code change hearings, and I'm not sure if it's possible to refine that so that when we bring up a code language for discussion before we get it to like a final vote, I'm assuming we're going to allow short comments, either yay or nay, to try to sway one way or the other, the rest of the board to get to the 2/3 vote. But limiting a certain amount of time, I don't know how official we want to get, but I think we're going to have to get kind of official to get done in a good amount of time instead of working till midnight like the old days of the code changes.
Yeah, Tim, I think great point. Again, we have a couple processes that we are considering using to make sure that we'll present the final language. Anyone who has any requested changes will have their allotment of time to try to sway the board that the change should be made, and then there can be a vote on those changes. So we definitely have those processes. I think we'll see I think we'll just kind of have to run the math and see how many votes we're doing, how many to understand what that time allocation will be for folks who want to lobby for changes within each code element. But we absolutely want to allow for that, those micro changes to happen in these final meetings. So, and we'll definitely be time limiting folks to their comments to make sure we can get through it all.
Good deal. Thanks. That helps. You might have said this, so I'm sorry if I'm going to ask a question, but the proposed code language that your team will be putting together, will you be sending that out pre-meeting to allow us to digest that? I think that's what you said, and kind of formulate our thoughts and any questions that we have.
Yes, absolutely. We will make sure that at a minimum it's sent out a week in advance, but our goal is going to be to try and get it out 2 weeks in advance so you guys have plenty of time to review. Perfect.
And then from a voting standpoint, I know this might be in the legislation, so I apologize. But if the vote doesn't get to 2/3, then by the ordinance, it goes to the executive committee. And what's the time frame for the executive committee to do I think that's in there, so I probably should just look it up. I don't remember it.
The executive committee, has the month of, I believe, someone can correct me if I'm misreading this, but I think the month of April, the executive committee has to make all of those final decisions. The draft code language needs to be ready May 1st, and then the report needs to be done June 1st. Andrew.
Yes, Tim raised a couple good comments. In the advanced distribution of model language, is there a desire to not just have a draft, but to have alternates included in a draft, whether it be by section, subsection? Or is it the desire just to have the answer proposed that people discuss and vote on? Or is it a preference to have almost not necessarily a multiple choice, but a compilation of 2 or 3 variations that may exist of each section that get looked at? That could be consistent with what was distributed in advance today for the EV, but more compiled by proposed section heading and subsections with 1 or 2 or 3 choices of draft language that could be reviewed and voted on? Or is that, so that's more of a discussion topic that I don't know if we've got there yet.
Yeah, I guess I would love to open it up to what folks on the board would prefer. I think the way that we've currently got it structured, so you guys can react to this, is our intent would be within meetings 5 through 8, we are covering and presenting all of those different variations and getting the information we need from the board to make a decision on a final set rather than a set of code options to then vote between. But Carolyn, I see your hand raised. Love to know thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was going to echo what you were saying. I think by the time we get to meeting 9 and 10, most, if not all, should be just one option of code language that is revised because we've resolved most of the differences. But I also hear Andrew's point, and we just need to recognize that we might get to meeting 9 and 10 with a couple of options that need to be on the table at that point in time. Let's not set that as the expectation, though. And from a time management perspective, try and resolve those differences in meetings 5 through 8.
Thanks, Carolyn. Any other thoughts on Andrew's question on the board? All right. I am not hearing any. I just also want to call attention to a couple of questions we got through the Q&A board. So will proposed code language be circulated to the Energy Code Board listserv, including non-board members ahead of meetings where language will be discussed? That's a fantastic question. And I would, I don't know. I might have to confer with Adam. David, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. But I'm happy to confer with Adam and sort of follow up on that specific question.
I can't think of a legal answer to your question, Kim. I think maybe we just want to think about how we can make the meeting run best. And that's something we can talk to Adam about. Okay.
Thanks, David. And then another question in the chat: decisions not receiving 2/3 support of the board only go to the code board's executive committee. They are matters that are required by statute, right? That might have been said and I missed it. Thanks. Yes, Ted. So any elements of the code board that are one of those required decisions that need to be made by the Energy Code Board, if not made, will move to the executive committee. So it's within that list of decisions that we presented. Okay, awesome. Any final thoughts or questions on our process? So with that, that's all we have for today, which ends us about an hour early. So before wrapping up, are there any last thoughts, comments, questions from anyone in the board before we sign off? Yeah, Kim.
This is just a question regarding accessing documents from the meetings. I know that they are posted online on the website, but when I've gone to try to download them, I get an error that I need permission via Google Drive. So I've sent a request that way, but I don't know if that's something that everybody is required to do, because I believe those are all supposed to be accessible to the public. So
Yeah, Kim, thanks for flagging that. I will get with Adam and see what's going on there. We'll make sure that all those documents are not, they shouldn't have a permission set on them. So we'll make sure we fix that. Thanks for letting us know.
Thank you.
Chris.
Just wanted to say great job on meeting administration. Appreciate the preparation and format. And I feel like we're well positioned for the next series. So glad to have your team here.
You're here.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, guys. Wonderful. Well, with that, I will let you all go with a reminder that our next board meeting is January 23rd, which is a Monday from 12 to 3 p.m. You guys will receive an agenda and some meeting materials from us ahead of time. And we'll also have that cost study summary ready for you guys at that meeting. So if anything comes up in the meantime, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Adam. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your Wednesdays.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cody. Thanks, Rick. And